Hello, my name is Ned Holstein, and I am speaking to you from Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. I am deeply honored to speak before this sparkling and crucially important group. You have placed yourself at the very leading edge of one of the most important issues facing the Western world today. I regret that I could not be there in person due to an injury suffered by my wife a few days ago, but I'm very happy to say that she's doing much better, but she still needs some help from me. I am the founder of the National Parents Organization. We are the largest organization in the United States devoted to shared parenting, with about 50,000 members, and we may be the largest organization of our kind in the world. We have three central principles. The first is shared parenting. The second is gender equality, and the third is respect for human rights and property rights. The International Council for Shared Parenting is a badly needed organization whose work has the potential to benefit tens of millions of children in numerous countries. The only similar organization I know of is the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, based in the United States and usually known simply as AFCC. This organization brings together researchers, mental health practitioners, attorneys, and judges to share knowledge about best practices in the family courts. But we need ICSP because AFCC is failing the test. It generally supports shared parenting in most situations, but unfortunately it continues to insist that every case requires complex, time-consuming, and expensive individual evaluation. This is a solution that is not a solution. AFCC describes its position in a, quote, think tank report on shared parenting that was issued only a few months ago. Distinguished researcher Sanford L. Braver of Arizona State University has reviewed this report, and he notes that throughout the think tank report, it is claimed that parenting arrangements must be individualized, must be decided case by case. Braver then notes that custody evaluators most commonly use IQ tests, the Rorschach test, the MMPI, the thematic apperception test, or TAT, the sentence completion test, and the Bricklin scales in their custody evaluations. But he observes that there is almost no empirical evidence to support the validity of any of these tests for predicting the effectiveness of parenting. Braver concludes, quote, "We may really not know how to properly individualize, tailor, or custom fit parenting plans to achieve the best possible outcomes in each case. And in such a case, better to have a rule or starting place that covers the majority of cases and families with, of course, the ability to deviate when the fit is obviously bad," close quote. In my mind, shared parenting is that, quote, rule or starting place that covers the majority of cases. In the end, the AFCC think tank report repeatedly notes that, quote, consensus wasn't achieved on very important issues. In other words, it fails to offer, quote, a rule or starting place that covers the majority of cases. And that is why we need a new approach, grounded in research, but recognizing the need for a rule or starting place that will help most children and most families, but from which there can be deviations occasionally when it is necessary. My personal hope is that ICSP will provide that new approach. Now, moving on, what is the state of shared parenting in the Western democracies today? Speaking of the United States, family law is made separately by each of the 50 states. Statistics on the outcomes of custody proceedings are gathered haphazardly by the various states, usually not by professional statisticians, and often not gathered at all. So the data is piecemeal, and it is often imperfect. But still, in 2011, Professor Braver reviewed the data and concluded that equal residential custody in the United States was occurring in about only 2% to 6% of families in recent decades. And Professor Linda Nielsen at the Wake Forest University in North Carolina in the United States also reviewed the literature and came out with about 5% to 7% of children living at least 1/3 of the time with each parent. She also wrote that, quote, "A change is clearly underway." Since the year 2000, she notes, in a few states, 30% to 50% of the children are living at least 1/3 of the time with each parent. And then, just 2 months ago, Maria Cancian published data on post-divorce living arrangements in the state of Wisconsin. In 2008, in Wisconsin, equal shared custody was ordered in 27% of cases, and unequal shared parenting was ordered in an additional 18% of cases, for a total of 45% of cases having some form of shared parenting. But note that as little as 25% of the parenting time still qualified for the category of unequal shared parenting, and also that this was just one state. Now, only 3 states or 3 jurisdictions in the United States have an explicit statutory presumption for shared physical custody of children, at least as of 2012. These are the District of Columbia, which many of you know better as Washington, D.C., Idaho, a very small state in the West, and Louisiana, with its heritage of Napoleonic law. There is no evidence that these 3 small jurisdictions have greater rates of shared parenting than the other states. And that is because in every state, family court judges are instructed to decide custody according to, quote, "the best interests of the child." So they retain very wide discretion to make custody decisions based on their personal biases, despite any language in the statute that may appear to favor shared parenting. Thus, in my view, the gradual improvement in shared parenting rates seems to reflect the child development research that so many of you are doing, demonstrating the benefit of shared parenting, and also reflects the changes in cultural values and gender roles. These factors seem to be much more important than any changes in the wording of statutes. I will not try to summarize the status of shared parenting in Europe because there are many people attending the conference who can do that better than I can. For instance, Dr. Vittorio Vezzetti has summarized the European data and presented it to the European Parliament in Strasbourg just a few months ago. My apologies to others who are present who may have published similar data. What does the general public in the United States think about shared parenting? The general public overwhelmingly supports shared parenting, but they do not favor shared parenting if the parents are unfit, if there has been domestic violence, or if they think that the request for shared parenting is simply a way to get out of paying child support. By way of example of the general public opinion, my organization, National Parents Organization, placed a question about shared parenting on the ballot in the state of Massachusetts in 2004. Almost 700,000 voters voted on this question, and of those, 86% favored shared parenting as the usual outcome. Polls in Canada show about 78% in favor, in Belgium about 70%, in Holland about 71%, and in the United Kingdom about 84%. This is overwhelming support. And among other things, it shows that ordinary women, as well as men, overwhelmingly support shared parenting. Now let me speak for a few minutes about the role of civil society in relation to research and in relation to practitioners. In my professional life, I am a physician. Early in my career, I participated in a great deal of research on the health effects of asbestos. I believe the asbestos story carries clear-cut lessons for the role of civil society in shared parenting. Now, this may seem far-fetched to some of you, but please just indulge me for a moment and let me make this case. Asbestos was incorporated into at least 3,000 products in the peak years, but unfortunately it also causes scarring of the lungs and it causes several cancers. Very importantly, which I will come back to, note that the health effects of asbestos do not show themselves until 30 or 40 years have passed since the exposure to asbestos began. I will return to this later because it's critical. Now, the first death due to asbestos was recorded in 1898. Follow this chronology with me. By 1917, a major life insurance company in the United States refused to write life insurance policies for asbestos workers, clearly indicating that it already understood that there were serious hazards in 1917 connected with this mineral. Now, the first wonderful research study of an epidemiologic nature was published in 1930 by the British scientists Merriweather and Price. Merriweather and Price demonstrated that asbestos could cause disabling and even fatal disease, not just in an occasional worker here or an occasional worker there, but in large proportions of exposed workers who were exposed to asbestos. Then in 1935 came the first suggestion that asbestos could cause lung cancer, and in 1943, a German scientist reported the first case of mesothelioma, an otherwise rare cancer, in the setting of asbestos exposure. During the 1930s, the hazards of asbestos were published widely, not only in medical journals, but also in lay publications, such as the Encyclopedia Britannica, and in various newspapers, magazines, and in the 1960s, this was also on television in the United States. The question arises, given this widespread knowledge of the health hazards of asbestos, what efforts were made to control this hazard? And what is the relevance of this story to our interest here today? Well, with the seminal publication in 1930, Merriweather and Price put forward and recommended means of decreasing asbestos exposures and the concentration of asbestos in the air in order to decrease the amount of illness. But these recommendations were largely ignored. In 1938, the first recommended limit on asbestos air concentration was published in the United States, but this was entirely voluntary and was not honored. Then many individual states adopted the suggested air concentrations as a regulation carrying the force of law, but it was almost never enforced. The same maximum air concentration appeared in federal law in the United States, but it only applied to a few companies, and it was rarely enforced. In other words, in summary, the research was largely ignored. Now, why were the labor unions, civil society, why were they not more visible in protecting their workers from asbestos? The answer is that until the mid-1960s, the labor unions treated workplace hazards as a reason for higher pay, not as a dangerous condition that the employer should be required to fix. It was only when the labor unions began to demand change, the civil society began to demand change, only then did the United States finally pass an emergency regulation to decrease exposures to asbestos, and finally by the mid to late 1970s, actual exposures did in fact begin to decrease. But this was over 40 years after the wonderful research by Merriweather and Price showing that asbestos could be disabling and even fatal to large numbers of people. Well, the new regulation, the new law was good news, but there was bad news, and that was that millions of people had already experienced significant exposures to asbestos. And because the health effects are delayed by 20, 30, or 40 years after the exposure, hundreds and thousands of exposed people were already in what you might call the pipeline and went on to develop asbestos-related diseases long after the regulations were already in force. Thus, even today in the United States, we still have 10,000 deaths per year in the United States due to asbestos, deaths that could have been prevented if the research had been honored and listened to. Now, I believe this history has several lessons for us today as we think about the role of civil society in bridging the gap between empirical evidence and socio-legal practice. We found with asbestos that research knowledge alone was necessary, but it was not sufficient. We also found that the skillful practice of medicine was necessary, but it was not sufficient. What was also necessary was that civil society, in the asbestos story, this was the labor unions, needed to make a determined effort to eliminate exposure to asbestos. In the same way, civil society has an important role to play in preventing the problems caused by the outmoded practices of the family courts today. The research knowledge is crucially important, but it's not sufficient. The wonderful effects of individual practitioners is of great importance, but it is not sufficient. Civil society must take a stand, and it must force the courts to implement what the wonderful researchers and the practitioners are telling us about the best interests of children. Now, this task is both critical and it is urgent. It is urgent because, like asbestos, every year that goes by puts more children into that pipeline so that sole custody may still be manifesting its negative effects 30 or 40 years from now among millions of people who were scarred as children by the sole custody decisions of the family court. For this reason, it is imperative that researchers, practitioners, and civil society all work together. And that is why I am so happy to see this gathering here today and the formation of the ICSP. Now let's talk about the research for a minute. My belief is that we have reached, or at least nearly reached, a critical mass of research demonstrating that shared parenting, generally speaking, ought to be Professor Braver's rule or starting place that covers the majority of cases. I believe the burden of proof has now shifted to those who oppose shared parenting. The children should have shared parenting unless it can be proven harmful to them, just as the burden of proof should have been shifted to the apologists for asbestos by the 1930s or 1940s. I also believe that the stakes are too high for us to wait for perfect science. The science of asbestos is still not perfect even today, but lives needed to be saved many years ago, and now children's lives need to be saved. The demand for perfect science is the enemy of children. We now need to supplement the general finding that shared parenting is beneficial with research that is much more fine-grained. First and foremost, we must figure out how and when to apply shared parenting to parents who have never been married, who now account for 40% of all births in the United States and 50% of births to the youngest parents. Second, it will be extremely helpful to document the effects of shared parenting in decreasing the divorce rate. Shared parenting could turn out to be a powerful yet non-coercive dampener of divorce. Third, we need to figure out how shared parenting can be done with parents who are poor because two homes are expensive. Fourth, we need more research about shared parenting with parents who are in conflict. We need to know how much conflict and what types of conflict are sufficiently severe that shared parenting becomes a bad idea. Fifth, we need to find out whether shared parenting remains favorable when what we really have is parallel parenting. Sixth, we need to find out how effective shared parenting is at preventing so-called parental alienation, because we know that condition is so hard to reverse once in place, and so we need to know if shared parenting is an effective measure for preventing parental alienation. Finally, let me tell you why I am extremely optimistic that shared parenting will soon become the norm in Western societies. First, we have the truth on our side, and the truth is always a powerful force in a democracy. The truth is that shared parenting is usually best for our children. The second reason is that our message is one of love. We are talking about two parents, each of whom love the child. It is very difficult to argue that loving parents are bad for children. Third, gender roles have largely converged, with both mothers and fathers being both breadwinners and child caretakers. This makes shared parenting an obvious solution. Fourth, the overwhelming public support for shared parenting that I described earlier will overcome the special interest groups that continue to block its progress, but only if researchers, practitioners, and civil society work together better than ever before. And once again, here's why we need ICSP. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts with this wonderful group here today. You are the seedbed from which beautiful flowers will grow. And last of all, let me say, go Germany! And also, go Argentina! Thank you.